On December 7, 1941, the Japanese made a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. On the following day, President Franklin Roosevelt declared war.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
But this declaration of war did not extend to Germany or Italy, who were at war with Britain and the Soviet Union. Japan did have a pact with Germany and Italy, but this only bound them to go to war if one of the others was attacked. Yet, Germany unilaterally declared war on the United States on the 11th of December. It was the third major strategic blunder Adolf Hitler would commit in 18 months. Hitler's inability to subdue Britain in the summer of 1940 was the first strategic error. The Luftwaffe's failure to destroy the RAF meant that the war in the West would continue. A year later, Hitler blundered again when he broke his 1939 non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. He opened a second front and committed Germany to a gargantuan struggle in the vastness of Russia, a struggle that would bleed the Third Reich dry. 6 months later, Hitler's declaration of war against the United States brought the world's largest economy and potentially most powerful military machine into the European conflict. Germany would now face a massive military buildup in the West and an exhaustive slogging match on the Eastern Front. Together, they would squeeze the Third Reich into submission. It was ironic that through his hasty step, Hitler succeeded to bring the United States into the war. While the U.S. supply of arms to the Soviet Union and Britain and activities by the U.S. Navy in the North Atlantic demonstrated increasing American support for the Allied cause, they were a source of irritation to Hitler. America's isolationism prevented her from becoming actively involved in the European conflict. Hitler was persuaded by Japan to declare war on the United States. He hoped that Japan would then return the favor and declare war on the Soviet Union, his ultimate miscalculation. At the end of World War I, America's traditional policy of isolationism reasserted itself. She did not join the League of Nations, predecessor to today's UN, even though President Woodrow Wilson had been the League's architect. By the mid-1930s, grappling with the effects of the Depression, America's determination to stay out of other nations' conflicts was reinforced by 3 neutrality acts passed by Congress. This was at a time when European fascism and Nazism were becoming ever more strident, increasing the likelihood of another European war. Across the other side of the world, a militaristic Japan was also threatening world peace. In 1937, Japanese forces invaded China and began a war that would last for 8 years. Realizing the threat to U.S. Pacific interests, President Franklin Roosevelt eventually lent Chinese Premier Chiang Kai-shek a limited sum of money to buy arms. When the war did break out in Europe in September 1939, Hitler knew that the U.S. would be a bystander, as she had been in 1914. After he had overrun Poland and a stalemate appeared to ensue on the Western Front, many Americans hoped that Britain and France would come to terms with Hitler. The Blitzkrieg campaign that overran France and the Low Countries in a mere 6 weeks led Hitler to conclude that Britain could not survive on her own and would quickly surrender. Many Americans came to the same conclusion. British Premier Winston Churchill thought otherwise. He knew that Britain could not defeat Germany and Italy on her own. He needed the U.S. as an ally. Churchill began to court Roosevelt. The president was sympathetic to Britain's plight, but he faced re-election in November 1940, and the Republican candidate, Wendell Willkie, was a strong isolationist who reflected the attitude of the overwhelming majority of the American people. Roosevelt therefore had to be very cautious in his dealings with Britain. The one active step that he took during that critical summer of 1940 was to trade 50 old World War I destroyers for a lease on British naval bases in the Caribbean. At the same time, in view of the turbulent state of the world, Roosevelt did manage to persuade Congress to allow him to call up the National Guard for a year's active duty. He also introduced limited conscription.
Serial number 158.
More significant, he began a massive naval expansion program. These steps were designed to prepare America against all possible threats. Meanwhile, Hitler, realizing that Britain intended to fight on and not surrender, was forced to make hurried preparations for an invasion. Key to this plan was air supremacy over southern England. However, during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, he failed to achieve this. Hitler, facing a stalemate in the West, therefore turned east towards Russia, his ultimate enemy, leaving Britain to suffer prolonged bombing by the Luftwaffe. It would be this radical change in strategy which would eventually lead to Hitler's blunder in declaring war on the United States. Hitler regarded the subjugation of Bolshevik Russia as his ultimate objective. It had been his goal even before he came to power. He recognized that Russia and Japan were traditional enemies since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Hitler decided to take advantage of this in his relationship with Japan. In 1936, Berlin and Tokyo signed the Anti-Comintern Pact. Its objective was to halt the spread of Marxist-Leninism. In September 1940, relations between Berlin and Tokyo were further cemented. Japan joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact, which pledged the signatories to come to each other's aid if any one of the three were attacked. Hitler's secret agenda was that Japan would join him when he attacked the Soviet Union. But while the Japanese maintained friendly relations with Germany, they had a different objective: the creation of an empire in Southeast Asia. In April 1941, they signed a 5-year non-aggression pact with Moscow, reducing the high tension on the border between Japanese-held Manchuria and the Soviet Union. This did not deter Hitler from mounting his invasion of the Soviet Union in June of that year. Indeed, he still believed that Japan would tie up considerable Russian forces on the Manchurian border. Throughout this time, Britain had been under constant German air attack. It was the Blitz which began to make Americans a bit more sympathetic to the British cause. London-based journalists like Edward R. Murrow of CBS sent back moving accounts of the steadfastness of the British people under this aerial onslaught. In November 1940, Roosevelt was elected to another term in office. He was convinced that sooner or later, the United States would find itself at war. But most Americans were still very much opposed to it. Indeed, as late as May 1941, a Gallup poll revealed that almost 80% of the population was against entering the war. At the end of 1940, in his State of the Union address, Roosevelt spoke to the American people on the essential freedoms at stake in the war.
To protect and to defend our science, our culture, our American freedom.
Roosevelt followed this up by introducing his Lend-Lease bill in early 1941. This was directed at both Britain and China, who were clamoring for American munitions. They lacked the means to make immediate payment for them, but Lend-Lease meant that they could make reparations at the end of the war. It was, as Roosevelt explained, like lending a neighbor a garden hose in order to put out a fire. These weapons were to be invaluable to Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union. Roosevelt also allowed secret military staff talks to be held with the British and Canadians to agree on a common strategy if America entered the war. The crucial decision reached was that in the event of war with both Japan and Germany, priority would be given to achieving victory in Europe. Events began to build up in the North Atlantic. U.S. merchant vessels were carrying Lend-Lease to Britain, but this laid them open to danger from Hitler's U-boats, which were ravaging the sea lanes. In April 1941, Roosevelt set up military bases in Greenland and extended the Pan-American Security Zone from longitude 60 degrees west to 28 degrees west. This brought it close to Iceland, then garrisoned by the British. That July, U.S. Marines began to relieve the British garrison on Iceland. American warships now had justification in escorting vessels this far east, aided by the American actions in the North Atlantic, but had no wish to provoke war with the United States at this point. With his panzers driving ever further east toward Moscow, he did not want to be distracted from conquest of the Soviet Union. Hitler therefore gave his U-boat crews strict instructions not to attack American ships. But his restraint would not be enough to prevent him from committing a grave blunder. German-U.S. tension rose in September 1941 with the first clash between the U.S. destroyer Greer and a U-boat. Roosevelt warned the Axis powers that their warships entering the Pan-American Security Zone would do so at their own risk. Furthermore, U.S. warships would now escort any vessel carrying Lend-Lease within the security zone. The aircraft and tanks that these ships carried were invaluable in maintaining the British forces in the Middle East and at home. American supplies also took some pressure off Britain's strained munitions industry. This fact and Roosevelt's warning further increased Hitler's irritation and that of his U-boat crews, who found it difficult in the midst of an action against a convoy to identify U.S. warships. But desperate to reach Moscow before the onset of the Russian winter, Hitler still refused to allow his U-boats to attack U.S. warships in the North Atlantic. Even so, as the autumn of 1941 wore on, there were clashes between the two, with American destroyers damaged and even sunk. In China, too, the Japanese continued to seize and occupy ever more of the country. The war feeling in America was still strong in spite of the Atlantic clashes. It was forced to agree with the deactivation of the National Guard divisions, and this was too. But growing U.S. Pacific interests did enable Roosevelt to get the Neutrality Acts repealed. The Americans withdraw from China. To this end, a limited embargo on the export of vital raw materials to Japan had been in force since July 1940. By the autumn of 1941, the Japanese were becoming ever more intransigent in their dealings with America. War between the two countries seemed increasingly likely. Provoked by the U.S. trade embargo, the Japanese had made up their minds that the U.S. Pacific Fleet was the main obstacle to the creation of their empire in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, an empire which would finally make them self-sufficient in raw materials. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, but they did not inform Hitler of their plan, tensions being inadvertently leaked to the Americans, the United States and Hitler by surprise. Near panic set in on America's west coast, where a Japanese invasion was feared. On the following day, the 8th of December, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan, but did not extend this to Japan's two Axis partners, Germany and Italy. The American people were certainly outraged over Pearl Harbor, but Roosevelt doubted that they felt the same about Germany and Italy. In Berlin, Japanese Ambassador Oshima demanded that Hitler declare war on America. Relax the restrictions placed on U-boats attacking American warships, but hesitated over taking the final step. Reminded Hitler that the terms of the Tripartite Pact only bound him to do so if America had been the aggressor, which clearly she was not. Hitler was conscious that his armies had become stalled in front of Moscow. The coming of winter was partly to blame. But another reason for the German failure to capture Moscow was the Russian reinforcements being rushed in from the Far East. Here, the likelihood of a clash with Japan had dramatically decreased since the signing of the Soviet-Japanese Non-Aggression Pact the previous spring. Ambassador Oshima had hinted to Hitler that Japan might revoke this pact if Germany went to war with America. Swayed by this, on December 11, 1941, Hitler finally made up his mind. In a speech in the Reichstag, he accused Roosevelt and the Americans and declared war on the United States. It was to be one of Hitler's greatest blunders. Not only did it let Roosevelt off the hook, but the Allies exercised their previous agreement that defeat of Germany and Italy would take priority over that of Japan. American manpower and material were to prove one of the decisive factors in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. But Hitler's miscalculation extended still further. His hope that Japan would revoke her non-aggression pact with Moscow came to naught. This meant that the massive Soviet war machine could devote all its energies to the defeat of Germany. It was probably itself at war with Germany. But the historic meeting between Russian and American troops on Germany's River Elbe on April 25, 1945, might well not have taken place so soon. Hitler's miscalculation about Japan's willingness to declare war on the Soviet Union sealed the fate of the Third Reich.